My name is Damian Fowler, and I would like to thank all of you for coming out. Today we're going to be having what I hope is an interactive discussion about the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. From a more radical, more realistic perspective than many of us have heard. I wanted to play two videos to begin with. Well, first let me step back. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a writer, I'm an activist, I'm a founding member of the Horry County Alliance for Educational Justice, and we're kind of a watchdog group that deals with education issues, issues of discrimination in the school district. We advocate on behalf of students who have been unjustly treated in the school system. We advocate on behalf of teachers of color who have been discriminated against. And that's our main work. We're a grassroots organization. That means we're not beholden to any corporate entities or any governmental entities. The school board members don't speak to me and call me by my first name and shake my hand. We're not on that type of wavelength with them. We hold them accountable whenever they do wrong. We tell them all the time, as long as they are treating all children the way that they're supposed to be treated in the school system and committed to having a diverse teaching and staff population in the school district, will be their allies. If they're not trying to do that, they're our enemies. It's as simple as that. And that's how we've been conducting this organization from its founding. All right. So if you have any other questions about my organization, we can talk about that after the presentation is over. Okay. So I wanted to start with this first video. Like I said, I had two videos that I wanted to play. The first video isn't really working that well. I'm not sure why, but we're going to play this. Now, one last thing. I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
All right. We've been having some issues with the sound, so we're going to have to listen very, very carefully to the computer. All right, so hopefully it's loud enough for everyone to hear it.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges, the government money, to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farm. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. This is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this case,
Okay. We've been having issues with the sound, so I apologize about that. But what Dr. King was going to say at the end was when they come to Washington for the Poor People's Campaign, it's simple. They're coming to get their check, meaning they're coming to get what's due to them. At the time, there was so much money being wasted on the Vietnam War. That money, Dr. King felt, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's organization felt, that money could be going to help poor people of all colors. And he calls the Vietnam War a demonic suction tube, because it was sucking the resources and money that could have been used to help the people here at home. So that's what he was talking about. When we come to Washington for this campaign, we're coming to get our check. We're coming to get what's due to us from this government. And we'll get more into the Poor People's Campaign as we continue the presentation. All right, next slide, please. All right. One thing I would like to do, I would like to thank the Black Collective Media Network. They did the video that you just saw. Okay, my friend Jason, he's the founder of the Black Collective Media Network, and he did the video. He said he was inspired to do that video based on the book that I've written about Dr. King, The Radical Political Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a political study guide. It's available on Amazon if anyone is interested. All right, so why the study guide? Why this presentation? Number one, wanted to start a conversation about the real legacy of Dr. King. I remember years ago when I was at Savannah State University, I was engaged in this debate with the professor, a professor in political science. I won't mention his name, but we're having this debate back and forth. We're on stage and everything, and it amazed me the type of things that he was saying about Dr. King that just simply weren't true. And this is someone with a PhD, and he was giving the same spiel about Dr. King, how he was a man of peace, and he was just, he had a dream and he was killed just because he had a dream, and we need to, do things the positive way. And whenever someone says we need to do things the positive way, that means the non-confrontational way, because that's what Dr. King would want. That's what he was saying. And of course, because I had done the research on King, I was working on the book back then, but it wasn't ready for publication, so I had known a lot. He was completely outmatched, because in historical research, we deal with things called primary resources. What are primary sources? So anyone who would like to answer that. What's a primary source?
When the person you
Okay, very good. First-hand information from the exact time or from the exact person that you're studying. Okay, so if you look at the record, Dr. King's record, everyone knows the "I Have a Dream" speech, and we only know the end of that because that's what's repeatedly played every year when we observe Dr. King's life. But Dr. King was a minister, he was a theologian, he was a sociologist, he did a lot of writings, did a lot of research, and he gave a sermon almost every Sunday, okay? So what does all of that say? What is he saying in all of these sermons? What is he saying in the 5 books he wrote? Okay, those are the primary sources that we need to draw from in order to understand the real legacy of Dr. King, okay? To defend Dr. King against the fictitious Malcolm-Martin dichotomy, I plan to show that Malcolm and Martin, when I was growing up, everyone had this, and growing up in the activist movement and human rights movement, what have you, there was a dichotomy of Malcolm versus Martin. Malcolm was for this, and Martin was for that. Malcolm was for violence, Martin was for nonviolence. And that's an oversimplified, incorrect way of putting it. So again, going back to the primary sources, you will see that Martin and Malcolm were more in line than we like to think. We're going to go more into that. To take Dr. King back from the white oppressors of poor people of color. Now, this January that just passed, there was the annual King parade, King celebration that's done in Myrtle Beach. It was put on by a brother named Benny Swan. He does it every year. And I was shocked at this one that they had last year, that the keynote speaker for that meeting, for that celebration, was none other than the Honorable Tom Rice. Okay? Now, I don't know, I like Benny, okay? I don't know what he was thinking when he did this, okay? I don't know what possessed him to think Tom Rice was the type of person who needs to be speaking on Dr. King, okay? For those of you who may not know who Tom Rice is, one step worse than Tom Rice is the Grand Dragon of the Klan, okay? But he came out with, and he spoke, he gave this ridiculous assertion during his talk that if Dr. King were alive today, he would be in support of Donald Trump's immigration policy. Hold on. It gets worse. It gets worse. He would be in support of Donald Trump's immigration policy because if the immigrants were allowed in, it would take jobs away from black people. Okay? Now, the thing, and that was, it got worse from there. I already knew, okay, yeah, this is about to be terrible. Benny Swan was there, several black leaders were there. I was the only one who got up and tried to correct him, okay, but I only had so much time with the microphone. I told him that if we had the rest of the day, there still wouldn't be enough time to correct everything he said wrong about Dr. King. Okay? But they took the mic from me. But, so, to take Dr. King back from the black bourgeoisie. Now, who knows what the black bourgeoisie is? It's a book. Someone said a book. Who said that? It is a book, yes. E. Franklin Frazier, a sociologist. Now, what did he say about the black bourgeoisie?
I think they're kind of black elites of African Americans.
Yes, the black elite among the African American community who are more concerned about their own personal class interests than they are the interests of the masses of black people. Okay? So these are the wealthy blacks who, like I said, they're only concerned about what benefits them in their community, in their social group, in their class group, and basically forget about all the other black folks, okay? They use Dr. King as a shield. They use Dr. King as a shield because Dr. King was a man of nonviolence. He was, to a certain extent, a pacifist. They use that as like, well, you know, let's not be too confrontational. Let's not fight too hard because, that would go against what Dr. King would want, okay? And these are people that we prop up in our community as role models. And when they spread falsehood like that, that leaves a very, very bad perception of Dr. King. So again, we're fighting against that. And the last one is kind of like what I was talking about. Remove Dr. King as the justification of the cowardice and inaction of black preachers. Okay? And we're going to talk about Dr. King's efforts, how he saw that many of the black preachers were politically disengaged, politically inactive, and we're going to learn about his methods and what he was trying to do to bring them in, okay? So what's the next slide? Reclaiming Dr. King's legacy. This is my favorite quote from Dr. King. Who would like to read it? Anyone like to read it? Who wants to? Go ahead. And read loud so everyone can hear you.
I choose to identify with the
Okay? All right. So again, that quote is the quintessential idea that Dr. King had when it came to his activism and his ministry. Okay, I'm not here for the powerful. I'm not here for the rich. I'm not here for the oppressor. I'm here for the dispossessed, the poor, the people who have been marginalized by this society. Okay? All right, so books written by Dr. King. How many of you know that Dr. King wrote 5 books? How many of you knew that before you saw it just now on the slide? Okay? All right, so he wrote an autobiography, okay? He also wrote Strength to Love, Why We Can't Wait. The Measure of a Man is one of my favorite books. It's a little small book, but it's more of his philosophical treatise than anything else. Okay, what the philosophical and moral foundations that he stands on as a pastor and an activist. Okay, and of course his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. All right. So also want to take a moment to show you a few more books, just for reference points. So when you go out and want to learn more about what we're talking about here, you know where to look. This is a copy of Where Do We Go From Here? All right. This is my favorite book by Dr. King. In fact, many people say this, and I agree with them. If you were to take this off and you didn't know who was writing this, you would think Malcolm X was writing this book. Okay? You look through it, look through the pages and look at what he's saying. You see a king that's a lot more radical than we give him credit for. All right? The Radical King is a collection of his speeches edited by Dr. Cornel West. All right? And it also takes a look at the radical things that he was saying. I've used this book as one of the reference books for our presentation. All Labor Has Dignity by Michael K. Honey, who's written a lot of great work on Dr. King, is Dr. King's speeches regarding the labor movement and the connection of the civil rights movement to the radical labor movement. In a Single Garment of Destiny, A Global Vision for Justice. This is from the King series, edited by Lewis Baldwin. All right. This is a collection of his statements and writings and speeches on international issues, okay? Because we only think of King as a domestic type of person, only focused on domestic issues within the United States. But he talks about the United States foreign policy, issues in other parts of the world, the connections that he had to revolutionary African movements, all right? So it's a great book. One of my favorite, Martin and Malcolm and America, A Dream or a Nightmare, by James Cone, who recently passed. You know, God rest his soul. He was a great man. All right. So this is a comparison of the activism of King and Malcolm, how they were different, how they were similar, and what drew them closer and closer together ideologically. Because you see that when you look at Dr. King's work near the end of his life, Malcolm and Martin were coming closer and closer together. And I'll discuss that more in the presentation. This is the book that I have that recently came out, To the Promised Land, Martin Luther King and the Fight for Economic Justice, okay? By another book by Michael Honey, all right? And he talks about King not as someone who embraces capitalism, but a Dr. King who was a democratic socialist. In fact, that's one of the tenets I have in this presentation. I'm gonna read them to you in a minute. He was a socialist, not a capitalist, and he didn't embrace capitalism, okay? 2 books I have here that are not about Dr. King, but are very important in understanding the general context of what we're going to be talking about today, is racial oppression in the global metropolis. It's a history of marginalized groups in Chicago, okay, and how Chicago came to be what it is today. And the reason I have this is because it gives you a better understanding of the successes and failures of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's Chicago Freedom Movement. Okay, it gives you a great understanding of the pitfalls of why that movement is seen as a failure, even though there were some victories. Many historians look back at the Chicago Freedom Movement as a failure. It's by Paul Street. And lastly, Barack Obama and the Future of American Politics, also by Paul Street. I'm going to say some things about Barack Obama that might be surprising to some of us, and this is one of the references I'm using. Okay? If you want more references, I'll be able to provide them. I wasn't able to bring everything. All right, so I'm going to begin with my conclusions. And I'm going to read them all to you, and then we're going to go through them one by one, okay? Conclusion number 1. The life and legacy of Dr. King and almost everything the average person knows about him have been colonized and hijacked by white capitalist power. Number 2, Dr. King believed in militant nonviolence as a, we're going to come back, we're just go back here. I'm just reading them off now.
Okay.
Dr. King believed in militant nonviolence as a tactical strategy, not necessarily as a way of life. Dr. King was in line with Malcolm X philosophically on the question of self-defense. Number 3, Dr. King was a democratic socialist. Number 4, Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Who knows what that is? The Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Yeah. Those organizations there in Atlanta that,
The SCLC.
SCLC, yeah.
It was, I mentioned it a few times. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that was Dr. King's organization, an organization that he founded with a group of ministers, okay, in Atlanta, exactly. All right. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference supported Black Power, not as a slogan, but as a program. This is number 5. Dr. King was seen as one of the most dangerous threats to the national security of the United States. Okay? Number 6. We'll get into that. Who said that? Oh, we'll get into that. All right, so number 6, Dr. King was one of the most reviled public figures in America at the time of his death. See, we all look now and say Dr. King was, everyone will agree, even those racist, reactionary, right-wing, conservative, neo-Nazi skinheads will say that Dr. King was a good man. But would they have said that back then, when he was alive? We can say it now because his legacy has been so tampered with and everyone's so misinformed about him. You know, you can pretty much get whatever you want out of Dr. King at this point. But what was being said of him back then? My next point, Dr. King was a fierce critic of the black middle class or the black bourgeoisie, among whom he found ferocious opposition. next one, and this is one of my favorite ones. Dr. King saw the gains of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act as cheap victories and moved toward fighting for a radical redistribution of political and economic power. Okay? This one, if I can survive past this one I'm about to say, I might be all right. All the documented evidence proves that Dr. King would have been a severe opponent of President Barack Obama and probably would have been jailed or assassinated during Obama's presidency. Okay? I can make it through that one without someone jumping on me. It'll be all right. And the last one, Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership's Conference's nascent Poor People's Campaign was a precursor to the more modern Occupy Wall Street movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. Okay, so we're going to draw a continuation from one movement to the other two. All right? Okay, so get ready to begin. All right. Okay, so we have about an hour. I'm going to try to go through this as quickly as possible. So I don't want to keep y'all too long. And they're going to come in here and kick us out in an hour anyway. So. How many of you remember this picture? Remember the big move all over the country to build the monument, the King Monument? I think it was in DC, right? And all of the people who were going around, you had the alphas going around raising money, hundreds of millions of dollars to raise money for the King Monument. Okay? Here are some of the folks that funded the monument, some of the business, some of the companies. Okay? Now I have a list here of these companies and everything they've done against marginalized folks. And this is what I called it. It's aggrandizement by a group of criminals who would have never supported King if King was alive. Okay? Come on, really? ExxonMobil supporting Dr. King? Okay? Go through this. Just a few of these. Walmart. That we know, Walmart was one of the funders of the monument. We all know about Walmart, starvation wages to its workers. Okay, the Walton family, one of the wealthiest families on the planet. Okay, and the money that they've donated to reactionary right-wing causes. AT&T was also a funder of the monument. With their working with the government on spying on Americans. JP Morgan and Chase, Goldman Sachs, Pfizer, Boeing. Now, Dr. King was a staunch opponent of war, and obviously, along with war, the weapons of war. But you have Boeing supporting the monument. Why would they support that? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Tommy Hilfiger. I don't need to go on that. Of course, Bank of America, which also at the time I was writing this, Bank of America was also funding the NAACP as well. And that's why when the NAACP sued and participated in actions against Wells Fargo for discriminating against black clients, they refused to go against Bank of America because Bank of America funds them and gives them money. Okay? So that was a stark contradiction. But Bank of America gave money as well, General Motors, General Electric. All right? So, and again, this goes to show the idea that if all of these organizations, all of these companies can give money and put their base and put their support behind Dr. King now, it shows that Dr. King's image, Dr. King's legacy has been utterly destroyed, utterly distorted. Okay? Next slide. All right, so on the issue of self-defense, we go back to the idea that neither Dr. King or Malcolm X were for violence. None of them called for violence. Okay? Because again, I go back to this idea that we have, oh, Dr. King was for nonviolence and Malcolm was for violence. No, Malcolm, you look at his speeches, he never said that. What did Malcolm say? He said, we're nonviolent with those who are nonviolent with us. Okay? Now this quote, I'm sorry. Oh. The quote I'm about to read to you here, I'm going to call on someone to read, comes out of Where Do We Go From Here on page 27. Who would like to read this? Want to read again? Okay.
So which one? First one, A?
Yeah, A.
So it's A, right?
Yes.
I contended that the debate over question of self-defense was unnecessary since people suggested that Negroes should not defend themselves as individuals when attacked. The question was not whether one should use his gun when his home was attacked, but whether it was tactically wise to give him a gun while participating in organized demonstration. Where do we go from here? Page 27.
Very good. Very good. Now, so what is this saying? Dr. King never said that black people who are participating, or anyone who's participating in the civil rights movement, should not defend themselves when they were personally attacked. Or if your home was being attacked by the Klan or the White Citizens Council or whoever, okay? He questioned the idea of whether it was tactically wise to engage in violence during demonstrations. There's a difference, okay? Because he was not talking about nonviolence and pacifism as a way of life in this. He was talking about nonviolence as a tactic, okay? I have another quote here. I'll read it here. These are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the world are rising up as never before. We in the West must support these revolutions. Okay, a little bit of context. What is happening during this time? During the time of the Civil Rights Movement? What's happening in the Caribbean? What's happening in Africa? Go ahead. Anyone? Who wants to take a guess of what's happening in the other parts of the world during this time?
I take a guess on the war, and in Africa, gave us starvation from war, getting guns and money from other countries and going against each other and killing off each other in Africa, which created vast poverty, or either around the country was Vietnam.
Well, yes and no. There are certain times, in certain locations, of course, what you're saying is correct. But what Dr. King was referring to, in this quote were the revolutions that were taking place throughout what we call the Third World, or the Global South. Okay? And the overwhelming majority of these revolutions, whether you're talking about in Africa or in the Caribbean with the Caribbean Federation movement, were violent struggles. Poor and oppressed people engaging in armed conflict with the nations of Europe that had them colonized. Okay? Also, the Kwame Nkrumah, who became the first democratically elected president of Ghana, invited Dr. King to his inauguration. Okay? They got that freedom through war. They got that freedom through revolution, violent revolution. And Dr. King was in support of that. Okay? All right. Oh, also, one more note on Dr. King personally. All right. This comes out of the one of Michael Honey's books. This is a quote from Michael Honey's book. Bayard Rustin and Glenn Smiley of the Friendship of Reconciliation, FOR, came to Montgomery to help King sharpen his understanding. This is during the Montgomery bus boycott. To help King sharpen his understanding of nonviolent direct action. And they convinced him to give up the arsenal of guns he had in his home to protect his family. Okay? So that shows that Dr. King, before they came and said, well, look, you know, how would it look if you're talking about nonviolence and you know, and you have all these guns in your home, whatever. And Dr. King, you know, kind of agreed with them. He's like, yeah, you're right. But he always defended other people's right to defend themselves. But as a figurehead, as a leader, he felt that, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't have these guns in my home personally. Okay? But he had an arsenal of weapons in his home before that. Okay? And even after that, there were, if you read this book, there were armed guards protecting King's house, okay, when he was away. All right? Next.
You gonna do B? B.
Oh. Who wants to read this? You know? You read it. Right here.
I believe I would have probably temporarily sacrificed my
Pacifism.
because it was such an evil force in history. I would willingly have fought against the
Menace.
Of the 1940s beyond, but in 1967.
Very good. All right. So this, I included this quote to show that Dr. King's pacifism wasn't something that was fixed. That wasn't something that he wasn't willing to break, regardless of the circumstances. It shows that if there were certain circumstances that called for it, Dr. King would have engaged in actions that, you know, were violent. Okay. So Dr. King was a democratic socialist. All right, who wants to read the first quote right here? Now this is from a letter to his wife in 1952. I want y'all to pay attention. This is not 1968 when he's saying this, okay? This is 1952, early on.
I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. Capitalism started out with a noble and high motive, but like like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it was revolting against. And that's in a letter to Loretta Scott King in 1952.
Very good. Okay. Now, in 1952, he said this. Now, if you go, how many of you are familiar with the King Papers? Collected by, was it Claiborne Carson? Yes. The King Papers that are housed at Stanford. All right. It's a collection of his writings and personal papers, and right now I think it's about 7 volumes. 7 volumes. Volume number 6 focuses primarily on Dr. King's ideas on capitalism and socialism. Okay, there's other stuff included, but many of the writings and statements that he has are focusing on his leaning more towards socialism and advocating for the abandonment of capitalism as an economic system. Okay, now this comes from that volume 6, which was in the library at Coastal Carolina University. This is the notes. This is notes that he was taking, that he had taken in one of his classes in graduate school. Okay. It was a course called Christianity and Society, where he criticizes aspects of Marxist thought, but asserts that capitalism has seen its best days. And he writes, Karl Marx, the German philosopher and economist, stated that capitalism carries the seed of its own destruction. This is an obvious fallacy in that state. There is an obvious fallacy in that statement. The fallacy is that it is limited to capitalism, leaving the impression that other social movements do not carry the seeds of their own destruction. The actual fact is that every social institution carries the seed of its own destruction. Its survival depends on the way the seed is nourished. Now, after admitting that there is a fallacy in Marx's statement, do we find truth therein, any truth therein? It is my opinion that there is. I am convinced that capitalism has seen its best days in America, not only in America, but in the entire world. It is a well-known fact that no social institution can survive when it has outlived its usefulness. Thus, capitalism is done. It has failed to meet the needs of the masses. We need only to look at the underlying developments in our society. There is a definite revolt by what Marx calls the proletarian against the bourgeoisie. Everywhere we turn, we are faced with strikes and a demand for socialized medicine. In fact, what is more socialistic than the income tax, the TVA, or the NRB? What will eventually happen is this: labor will become so powerful, this is certainly evidenced by the recent election, that she will be able to place a president in the White House. This will inevitably bring about the nationalization of industry. That will be the end of capitalism. I'm not saying that there is a conscious move towards socialism, not even by labor. The move is certainly unconscious. But there is a definite move away from capitalism, whether we conceive it as conscious or unconscious. Capitalism finds herself like a losing football team in the last quarter, trying all types of tactics to survive. Okay? Graduate school. So, I mentioned that to say that all throughout his life, all throughout his public life, there was a criticism of capitalism. He saw very early on that capitalism, one thing that he liked to say, capitalism deprives the masses to give luxuries to the classes. Okay? During staff retreats, King often requested that the tape recorders be switched off so he could express his views frankly and honestly about the need for a complete revolution, that should be revolution in the American political economy, replacing capitalism with some form of socialism. And that's from Malcolm and Martin by Dr. James Cone. Okay? I want y'all to focus on something real quick. He requested that the tape recorders be switched off. Why do you think he would do something like that?
So his words could be taken out of context and switched around and used against him.
What was going on in America during this time that would make him very hesitant about embracing socialism completely and publicly? McCarthyism.
Just a scare of communism and, war.
Absolutely. There was, go ahead. Absolutely. There was this anti-communist sentiment that was pervasive throughout America at the time. And King knew if he openly identified himself as embracing socialism, which people, they don't, yeah, if they didn't see, his enemies wouldn't have seen a difference between socialism and communism. To them, it's all the same. So if he was publicly embracing this, that would have probably been the end of his public life, the end of his career, okay? They would have gone out of their way to completely discredit him, which they did, but the only thing that kind of held that back is the idea that, he wasn't really publicly embracing it. He was saying it within closed quarters, in personal letters, among his colleagues and what have you. But only later on he began with the more severe critique of capitalism.
You think it was during some of his meetings down at Penn Center that some of these very discussions were going on?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Also, you can associate that too with the lack of education in the area, because we weren't allowed to educate ourselves or be educated, especially in the
Rank and file Americans did not see
right.
that everyone was pretty much in lockstep when it came to the idea of communism and socialism.
Right.
And that sentiment, that anti-communism sentiment, or anti-red sentiment, was, like I said, pervasive throughout the American public. There's great writings by Christopher Hedges, who talks about, just the idea of certain activists and certain community organizers being accused of being communists, cost them their jobs. Okay? All right, next slide. Dr. King, in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, supported Black Power not as a slogan, but as a program. Okay? Now, this quote comes from, where do we go from here? Council Community, page 36. Now, Dr. King is having a debate, really, with Stokely Carmichael, who would later call himself Kwame Ture, and Floyd McKissick, okay, about the question of Black Power, right? So I'm just trying to give the backdrop, and he talks about this in the book, what happened during that conversation. And he writes this. Dr. King stated that ethnic groups such as Irish and Italians did not use slogans of Irish power or Italian power, but they worked hard to achieve power. King stated, "This is exactly what we must do. We must use every constructive means to amass economic and political power, but this is the kind of legitimate power we need." He added, "But this must come through a program, not merely a slogan." okay? And interestingly enough, the idea of the Black Power slogan was being defended by Stokely Carmichael. And we know Stokely Carmichael and Willie Ricks, who is a mentor of mine. They came up with the Black Power slogan, okay? And of course, it'd be very instructive to kind of read the full chapter where Dr. King talks about the pros and cons of embracing the type of Black Power that Stokely Carmichael was talking about. Okay, Black control of the inner city. I don't know why I didn't put it on the slide, but I have it here in my notes. I'm going to read it to you. Now, this, what I'm about to read to you, came after Dr. King's and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's Chicago Freedom Movement, okay? And looking back on the pitfalls of that movement, he says the following. Bear with me a moment, y'all. Okay. He says the following. This is in a speech that he gave in St. Louis after the end or near the end of the Chicago Freedom Movement. Now, I don't believe in black separatism. I'm against it. But I do say this. It seems that our white brothers and sisters don't want to live next door to us. So they're pinning us in central cities. We're hemmed in. We can't get out. They won't pass a fair housing bill here. But that's true for every city in the country. Now, since they're just going to keep us here, what we're going to have to do is just control the central city. We've got to be mayors of these big cities. And the minute we get elected mayor, we've got to begin taxing everyone who works in the city who lives in the suburbs. I know this sounds mean, but I just want to be realistic. Okay? So Dr. King was saying, why would he say something like that? What's going on in Chicago and other major cities during this time? Someone said it.
She said white flight.
White flight, very good. Absolutely. Okay, so you have a lot of the white citizens in the city who are leaving the inner city and going out to the suburbs to get away from black people who are moving into the area. Of course, you have black people coming up from the south, going north in search of jobs and what have you, and then subsequent to that, you have white people leaving. Okay? But even though they left, Dr. King was seeing that there was still control of those white folks who were living in the suburbs. They still had economic and political control of those inner cities where there was now a majority of black folks. And Dr. King was saying, let's use our electoral power to kind of get political and thus economic control of these areas. Okay, so we can have some justice in these areas. Because he concluded from Chicago that as long as you have the good old boy establishment in those areas, controlling those areas, there was never going to be any benefit to black people. Okay? All right, so this next quote, I wanted to play it on the computer, but again, we've had some audio problems, so I'll just read it to you. And I want you to, as I'm reading this, I want you to think about where this, who Dr. King might have gotten this from, okay? I come here tonight, this is from a speech they did. I come here tonight to plead with you. Believe in yourself and believe that you are somebody. As I said to a group last night, Nobody else can do this for us. No document can do this for us. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation can do this for us. No Kennethsonian or Johnsonian Civil Rights Bill can do this for us. If the Negro is to be free, he must move down to the inner resources of his own soul and sign with a pen and ink of self-asserted manhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. Don't let anybody take your manhood. Be proud of our heritage. We don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in the dictionary for the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading, low, and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure, high, and clean. Well, I want to get the language right tonight. I want to get the language so right that everybody will cry out, yes, I'm black and proud of it. I'm black and beautiful. Who did you get that from?
What's the big smile, was
Who else talked about looking in the dictionary and seeing the definitions of black and white? Elijah Muhammad, absolutely. Okay?
Elijah Muhammad, that's pretty good.
Yes. All right. So, black is beautiful, and I don't. Again, growing suspicion of whites. Let me get to this for. All right. So after what happened in Chicago, and just as time went on throughout King's public career, he started seeing that there was this, I guess in today's context we would call it white privilege, but it wasn't called that back then, okay? And he had something to say about white liberals, okay? Uh-oh. All right. Now this comes from his letter from Birmingham jail. I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate, which today is the white liberal. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in our stride toward freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, prefers that to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom. Okay? If you go back to one of his books, the title of one of his books is Why We Can't Wait, okay? And even throughout his letter from Birmingham jail, he's constantly explaining, not to the white racist reactionary, but to white allies. We have to push. We have to do it. There's no time like the present. It has to be done, okay? But because of what we today call white privilege, I was talking with Mal before we began about the results of the recent election, and I referred to a man by the name of Boots Riley, who's black, and he says that, you know, we're satisfied with fighting a war of inches, okay, rather than broad and sweeping progress. All right, so war of inches, meaning what? Meaning, oh well, we have more Democrats in office now than we did before, so that's a victory, okay? But for the masses of people who are marginalized in the society, there's still poverty, there's still homelessness, there's still black people being gunned down in the street, there's still the Proud Boys running around jumping people as they're coming out of the Walmart, okay? You have people being, you know, you have terrorist plots going on, you have the rise of fascism, okay? But it's all good because we have a couple more Democrats in office. You know. And so I'm kind of jumping back and forth here, but you know, going back to Dr. King, that's what Dr. King was talking about. Like, no, you don't set the timetable for us. We set the timetable, and if you're our ally, if you're truly our ally, you come with us on the timetable that we set. Okay? You don't tell us when we should be fighting for this and when we shouldn't, or how we should or shouldn't. Okay? All right. At 30 minutes, I'm almost done, y'all. All right, one last quote about this, and we'll move on. The thing wrong with America is white racism. White folks are not right. Now, they've been making a lot of studies about the Negro, about the ghetto, about slums. It's time for America to give an intensified study of what's wrong with white folks. Anybody that will go around bombing houses and churches, there's something wrong with them. Okay? So not only was he critical of these acts of terrorism by racist whites, but he was also completely outraged by the indifference of many other white people in the country who looked at that and said, okay, who weren't driven morally to fight against that type of stuff happening, okay, who are still sitting on the fence, who are still neutral, okay. So that was a criticism of them as well. Now, Dr. King's Pan-African work is covered in this book here. Like I mentioned before, Dr. King, and I'll just mention a few things about this. Dr. King formed an organization called the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa and the American Committee on Africa. And that was kind of today we would call it, a similar organization would be called the Trans-Africa Forum, founded by Randall Robinson. But these two organizations, Dr. King helped found as a way of trying to influence the government regarding its foreign policy with African countries. Okay? Very early on, they were fighting against apartheid. Very early on, they were trying to deal with the colonial issue happening in many parts of Africa and what happened. So, like I said, Dr. King had connections with people like Nelson Mandela, Kwame Nkrumah, and other revolutionary leaders. All right. Last quote I'm going to read on this is comes out of Radical King. This is about his connection to Malcolm X. The FBI transcripts of June 27, 1964, a phone conversation reveals Malcolm X receiving a message from Martin Luther King Jr. This message supported the idea of getting human rights declaration of the United States to expose the unfair, vicious treatment of black people in America. Malcolm X replied that he was eager to meet with Martin Luther King Jr. as soon as the next afternoon. Okay? So you have Malcolm and Martin sending messages to each other about working together, because we all remember Malcolm was saying he was going to go to the United Nations to have the United Nations condemn the United States for its treatment of black people, okay, domestically. And he was also trying to get other nations, in the third world, Arab and African nations, to support him in doing this. And Dr. King reached out to Malcolm to say, look, what you're doing is a great thing and I'm going to support you. Can you imagine Malcolm and Martin standing together at the podium at the United Nations saying that the United States needs to be condemned for what it's doing to black people? you know what kind of image or what kind of reverberations that will have throughout the world? All right, let's move on to the next thing. All right, Dr. King.
Was this the right one? Here. 6. Hold on, we're having some problems. There it is. Yeah.
Dr. King was seen as one of the most dangerous threats to the national security of the United States. This quote comes from the Drum Major Instinct sermon in '68. I need someone to read this.
God didn't call America to do what she's doing in the world now. God didn't call America to engage in senseless, unjust war as the war in Vietnam. And we are criminals in that war. We're committed more war crimes than almost than any nation in the world. And I'm going to continue to say it. And we won't stop it because of our pride and our arrogance as a nation. But God has a way of even putting nations in their place. The God that I worship has a way of saying, don't play with me. He has a way of saying, as the God of the Old Testament used to say to the Hebrews, don't play with me, Israel. Don't play with me, Babylon. Be still and know that I'm God. Be still and know that I'm God. And if you don't stop your reckless course, I'll rise up and break the backbone of your power. Drum Major Instinct. Sermon, February 4th, 1968.
Okay. Amen. All right. So, as we were, let me go back. Now, this was in '68. After Dr. King gave his speech, what we misnomer the "I Have a Dream" speech. What was the real name of that speech, by the way? Who can tell me the real name of that speech? It wasn't "I Have a Dream" speech.
I bet Mel knows it.
Don't. I know that he changed in the middle of the speech because Mahalia Jackson said, "Tell him about the dream, Martin," but I forget the name of it at first.
Sorry for putting you on the spot.
I'll give a prize to whoever can tell me the name of that speech. A prize. Just. The March on Washington, the speech I'm talking about was the March on Washington speech. But we misnamed it the "I Have a Dream." That wasn't the name of it. It was "Normalcy, Never Again." That was the original name of the speech. Normalcy, never again. Why would he say that? Normalcy, never again. I don't want to get off too far off topic, but why would he say that? What's wrong with normalcy?
Well, he was planning on changing the norm. So the norm at the time was racial oppression towards the poor folks and African Americans.
So Dr. King was saying, throughout his speeches, he would talk about being maladaptive to oppression, maladapted to poverty, maladapted to war, militarism, maladapted to predatory capitalism, okay? Not adapted to these things, not well adjusted to these things. He called for eternal hostility. That's a direct phrase from him, declaring eternal hostility. But today we talk about civility. Well, we have to be civil, we don't want to offend anyone. We don't want to make anyone feel bad. But Dr. King called for hostility against racism, militarism, and materialism. Okay? We should go out into a hostile world declaring eternal hostility against the evil triplets. All right? But after that speech, J. Edgar Hoover declared that Martin Luther King was one of the most dangerous men in America, and that there had to be a heightened surveillance of Dr. King's movements. And Dr. King, not only of Dr. King, but also of Dr. King's family's movements as well. Because one of the things, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to cover as much in this presentation was the work that Dr. King's wife, Ms. Coretta Scott King, was doing. Because she was traveling and speaking and participating in demonstrations in her own right, okay? But again, the mythos, the patriarchal mythos, is that she was just at home, you know, baking cookies and taking care of the kids with the apron on, okay, while Mark was doing all the work. All right? Who is Stanley Levinson? We're not going to go too deep in this because we already talked about the whole issue of communism. But can anyone tell me who Stanley Levinson is?
He was one of the advisors to King.
Very good.
I think he lived in New York and he was quite a socialist. Maybe communist.
Absolutely. So Stanley Levinson was a senior advisor in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and he was an avowed socialist. And the FBI tried to use Stanley Levinson to tie really kind of an albatross around King's neck. Okay, said, see, all this time we were saying that he was a communist. Look who he's got working for him. He's got Stanley Levinson, big bad Stanley Levinson, who's a communist. Okay, so I bring that up as an example, an illustration of the efforts of the government to discredit Dr. King. Let's go. Yes, go ahead.
I'd just like to point out that 2 months after J. Edgar Hoover said that he was the most dangerous person in America, King was dead. 2 months.
Right. So, so we're talking about a consistent sentiment on the part of the American government to push this idea. Oh, one last thing on this point. This comes out of the book on Dr. Honey by Dr. Honey. Just bear with me a minute, y'all. I apologize. Okay. This is a lengthy quote, but I think it's really a great illustration of what we're talking about here. Southern segregationists and the ultra-right John Birch Society sent out pamphlets and postcards and mounted billboards on southern highways claiming to picture King at a communist training school. In fact, a picture of King and Rosa Parks and Miles Horton at the non-sectarian Highlander Folk School, the one institution in the South where blacks and whites were encouraged to frankly discuss issues. A right-wing campaign by neo-Nazis and pro-military anti-communist groups painted the famous Baptist preacher as a communist. By 1968, King had suffered a bombing of his home and his hotel room, body blows by a neo-Nazi in the South, stoning by whites armed with baseball bats wanting to kill him in the suburb of Chicago, a raucous anti-communist shoutdown in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, largely due to his stand against the Vietnam War. Death threats plagued King and his family. Some saw him as a dangerous radical troublemaker. Others thought King wasn't radical or militant enough. King's philosophy of love and nonviolence looked like old-fashioned sentimentalism, unsuited to violent American realities. I'm gonna skip down a little bit. Many in the business and political classes also opposed King's strong support for unions as a way to obtain a greater degree of racial and economic justice, although today many have come to see King as an icon for American values. In his own time, he was reviled, physically attacked, and dismissed as a false prophet. In 1968, he was struggling to survive. Okay? Another thing, I mentioned the John Birch Society. Do y'all know who founded the John Birch Society?
Well,
one of the founders, the primary founder, a man by the name of Fred Koch. Where do we know that name from? Fred Koch. Those are his sons, absolutely. Okay, so they have a long history of making a mess. All right. So we're going to go through this. We've got a few more minutes left. Is this the next one?
Yep.
Okay. Now, King was one of the most reviled public figures in America at the time of his death. According to one poll, at the time of King's assassination, not only did an overwhelming majority of white Americans view King as irrelevant, but a majority of black Americans, you see that number? Viewed King as ineffective as well. 60%. Okay. New York Times further called King a drawly bumpkin, so ignorant that he had not read a newspaper in years. This is a quote, and I'll read through this, and it's for the sake of time. They, and he's talking about the media, applauded us in the sit-in movement when we nonviolently decided to sit in at lunch counters. They applauded us on the freedom rides when we accepted blows without retaliation. I don't have my glasses on, I can't see. They praised us in Birmingham and Selma, Alabama. All the press was so noble in its applause and praise when I would say, be nonviolent toward Bull Connor, be nonviolent toward Jim Clark. There is something strangely inconsistent about a nation and a press that would praise when you say, be nonviolent toward Jim Clark, but will curse and damn you when you say, be nonviolent towards little brown Vietnamese children. Okay? All right. King was a fierce critic of the black middle class or the black bourgeoisie. In one speech, now this comes out of the 3-volume set by, now I'll help you, what's the 3-volume set by At Canaan's Edge? I know that was a third, right? I can't remember. It's not coming to me now. As soon as we're done, I remember it. But in the speech, this talked about in that book. It's a book about the civil rights movement and King's work in it. He criticized his own fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, for spending more money on alcohol for their convention than they donated to civil rights groups like the NAACP. Okay? And I want to talk about conflicts with other black leaders. Let's go to the next page. Okay, who are these people? Who's this person? We'll go one at a time. Who is that? Who is he? No, this fellow right here. Who? This fella is a fella named Carl Rowan. Carl Rowan. Now, he's a well-known, legendary journalist, okay? He was a severe critic of Dr. King and put out information that was being fed to him by the FBI about Dr. King's communist leanings, okay? But the information that he was a well-known journalist, well-known writer, so when he would write stuff, many people in black America took it seriously. But little did they know at the time that he was being fed stuff from the government to say about Dr. King. And he was being paid to do this, okay? Now he's seen as a legend. He's dead now, but he's seen as a legend in black journalism. And that says more about what Cornel West calls the Rowanization of black media. How we have black media that's kind of pro-government, you know, kind of against the grassroots, you know, saying that they're misguided, misinformed, or what have you. Who's this fellow? Adam Clayton Powell. Now, if you read, there's another book that I didn't bring with me called Death of a King, the last year of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. And he by Tavis Smiley. And Tavis writes about the horrible, despicable things Adam Clayton Powell would say about Dr. King to his face. Tavis Smiley recalled one time where they were all out to dinner together, and Adam Clayton Powell just spent the entire dinner just bullying King and you know, questioning his manhood and saying, oh, you know, you're a punk, you know, you talk about all this stuff, teaching people about being nonviolent, that's passé, you're a has-been. He spent the entire dinner saying this to Dr. King. And all Dr. King did was just sat there and ate his food. He didn't say a mumbling word back, okay? Also, and what I think is more importantly, when it comes to Democratic folks, when Dr. King was going to boycott or picket the Democratic National Convention one year, this man stopped it. And he said that if you boycott, he was a politician, a Democrat obviously, he said to King, if you picket this convention, I'm going to put out a rumor that you're having a homosexual affair with Mayor Busted. And King didn't go forward with the boycott. Okay? Of course, he knew it wasn't true, but it wouldn't have mattered. People were just biting at any reason to criticize Dr. King and discredit him. So Dr. King felt like it was too risky to go forward with the boycott. But it kind of goes to show you how dedicated this man was to power. Now, he was a good politician in retrospect. He represented the area consisting of Harlem and other parts of New York City. And he got stuff done for his constituents. But personally, from a moral standpoint, he was very, very, you know, amoral. Of course, we all know who this is, right? Thurgood Marshall.
Monument in King Street.
I'm sorry?
There's a monument in King Street, courthouse grounds, honoring him and Dr. King.
Oh, really? That's interesting, because he's hated Dr. King. Dr. King, he called Dr. King a boy on a man's errand. And in hindsight, when he was asked once about Dr. King, Thurgood Marshall said that as a civil rights leader, Dr. King wasn't worth shit. He would always get himself arrested, and the SCLC would come to us. He was with the NAACP to bail them out. So his anger toward Dr. King came from the NAACP having to spend its resources to bail out SCLC members. Okay. I didn't mean to curse, I apologize. But who's his last person? This is Whitney Young. Whitney Young. Whitney Young at the time was the president of the National Urban League, okay? And Whitney Young and Roy Wilkins became staunch opponents of Dr. King when Dr. King came out against the Vietnam War, okay? Because the connections that Whitney Young had to the Johnson administration, he felt those were being threatened by what Dr. King was doing, speaking out against the Vietnam War, okay? And there's even, in this book, there's even one story that's recounted in the book where Whitney Young confronts King at a public meeting and is shouting at him and saying, how could you do this? President Johnson is the best president the black man has ever had. You're crazy for doing that. How could you? And Dr. King replies to him that, Whitney, what you're saying might get you a foundation grant, but will it get you into the kingdom of truth? Okay? You're so busy trying to side up to powerful people to get money for the National Urban League. You're missing the point of why we're engaging in civil rights in the first place. All right? Next slide. this is a lengthy quote. I won't read it, but I'll just move on. But he's basically talking about how the black bourgeoisie has gotten out of the stench of they've gotten out of the backwoods, and they've used their ability to rise up economically based on the work of people who will never go to the colleges that they were able to go to, who worked as field hands, and women who worked as maids and in white people's houses and things like that. And because they did the work that they did, the middle class, the black middle class, is able to have a better quality of life. But that black middle class now is looking down their nose at the people who are still doing that type of work. Okay, so we'll just move on. Dr. King saw the gains of the Civil Rights Movement, Voting Rights Act, and the Civil Rights Act as cheap victories, and moved toward fighting for a radical redistribution of political and economic power. I'm just going to read two quotes in the interest of time, and we'll move on. And again, this right here is was one of my favorite things to write about, especially every election time, because they like to talk about your ancestors dying for the right to vote, right? Let's see what Dr. King says about that. All right, this is from Where Do We Go From Here? The practical cost, on this up here if you want to read along, the practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap. The limited reforms have been obtained by bargain rates. There are no expenses and no taxes are required for Negroes to share lunch counters, libraries, parks, hotels, and other facilities with whites. Even the psychological adjustment is far from formidable. Having exaggerated the emotional difficulties for decades, when demands for new conduct became inescapable, white Southerners may have trembled under the strain, but they did not collapse. Even more significant changes involved in voter registration required neither large monetary nor psychological sacrifice. Spectacular and turbulent events that dramatized the demand created an erroneous impression that a heavy burden was involved. Think about that now. Because in today's time, they show all the people getting sprayed down with water hoses and the dogs and all like that, and people point to that and say, look what your ancestors had to go through to get the right to vote. But Dr. King is saying, no, that's cheap. We got that at cheap. Okay? The real costs lie ahead. The stiffening of white resistance is recognition of this fact. The discount education given Negroes will in the future have to be purchased at full price if quality education is to be realized. Then he gets really bold. Jobs are harder and costlier to create than voting rolls. The eradication of slums housing millions is complex far beyond integrating buses and lunch counters. Okay? I'll read one more to you, and then we'll move on. In 1963, in Washington, D.C., this is a speech that he gave in Atlanta, Georgia, and this is 67. In Washington, D.C., I tried to talk to the nation about a dream I had. And I must confess that not long after talking about that dream, I started seeing it turn into a nightmare. Just a few weeks after I talked about it, it was when 4 beautiful Negro girls were murdered in a church in Birmingham, Alabama. I watched that dream turn into a nightmare as I moved through the ghettos of the nation and saw black brothers and sisters perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. I saw the nation doing nothing to grapple with the Negro's problem of poverty. I saw that dream turn into a nightmare as I watched my black brothers and sisters in the midst of anger and understandable outrage, in the midst of their hurt, in the midst of their disappointment, turn to misguided riots to try to solve their problems. I saw the dream turn into a nightmare as I watched the war in Vietnam escalating. Yes, I am personally the victim of deferred dreams and of blasted hopes. Okay?
Before you think on civil rights and voting rights, did you come across any information about Dr. King's visit to King Street on May 8th of 1966 when the street was marching on ballot boxes?
Yes,
Okay.
I did, yes. And again, we're not talking about a complete dismissal of voting rights. But what I think Dr. King was getting at was the idea that, okay, all this isn't just about voting. All this isn't just about getting the right to vote. Okay, there are other things that we need to have far beyond just the right to the ballot box before we can call ourselves true citizens of America. Okay. Okay. Thing about Barack Obama. Okay. And I included this picture here because when Barack Obama was elected, there was this a lot of these pictures out where, you know, Dr. King and Barack Obama are in the same picture together and all like that. And I saw one in Savannah where Dr. King was asleep and the little dream cloud coming up from his head with the picture of Barack Obama. Okay? As if to say that Barack Obama was the fulfillment of Dr. King's dream. And for a long time, many people said that. Y'all do remember that one thing they have in common is that they're both Nobel Prize winners. You do know that, right? Okay. Let's go to the next slide. I want to show you something. Let's compare their lectures and see what they said. This is Barack Obama's Nobel Prize lecture, a part of it, December 10, 2009. I do not bring with me today a definitive solution to the problems of war. What I do know is that meeting these challenges will require the same vision, hard work, and persistence of those men and women who acted so boldly decades ago. And it will require us to think in new ways about the notions of just war and the imperatives of a just peace. We must begin by acknowledging the hard truth. We will not eradicate violent conflict in our lifetimes. There will be times when nations acting individually or in concert will find the use of force not only necessary, but morally justified. I make this statement mindful of what Martin Luther King Jr. said in the same ceremony years ago. Violence never brings permanent peace, it solves no social problems, it merely creates new and more complicated ones. As someone who stands here as a direct consequence of Dr. King's life's work, I'm a living testimony of the moral force of nonviolence. I know that there's nothing weak, nothing passive, nothing naive in the creed and lives of Gandhi and King. But as a head of state sworn to protect and defend my nation, I cannot be guided by their examples alone. I face the world as it is. Remember that now. Remember what he says. I face the world as it is and cannot stand idle in the face of threats to the American people. For make no mistake, evil does exist in the world. If nonviolent movement could not have halted Hitler's armies, negotiations cannot convince Al-Qaeda's leaders to lay down their arms. To say that force may sometimes be necessary is not a call to cynicism, it is a recognition of history, the imperfections of man, and the limits of reason. Okay? We don't have enough time to talk about the violence he does to history with that quote and how inaccurate it is. Let's go to the next. This is what Dr. King said during his Nobel lecture. I refuse to accept the idea of the isness of man's present nature. That the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the central oughtness that forever confronts him, I refuse to accept the idea that man is mere flotsam and jetsam in the river of life, unable to influence the unfolding events which surround him. I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept the cynical notion that nation after nation must spiral down a militaristic stairway into the hell of thermonuclear destruction. I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. That was in '64. Okay? So it seems that Barack Obama is coming now in 2009 with a direct repudiation of everything Dr. King stood for as articulated in his lecture. Okay? It seems almost as if he read Dr. King's Nobel lecture and said, how can I dismiss this? Okay? You have a Nobel Peace Prize lecture that justifies war. And for Dr. King, there was no such thing as a just war. War is war. Okay? And should be taken as an absolute last resort. And the examples that Barack Obama gave of Al-Qaeda and what have you, there are other things that could have happened to avoid that. Okay? So, let's go to the next slide. All right, so, and we're going to skip over this in the interest of time. This is one of the ones I was looking forward to doing. But,
I don't know that anyone has the room right after us.
okay.
You could kind of speed through it if you want.
But, now, Dr. King spoke against the evil triplets. I mentioned them already. Review. What are the evil triplets? Militarism. Exactly. Very good. All right. So, and I include in the presentation and in the book examples of where Barack Obama engaged in things that promoted and that further racism, militarism, and materialism or capitalism. Okay? Just pointing out a few things. I was intimately involved with working with Troy Anthony Davis's sister to get him, he was falsely accused of murdering a police officer. And there was evidence, overwhelming evidence that he didn't do it. He was innocent. There was an appeal from Troy Anthony Davis's family to the administration to stop the execution. Never heard back. Okay. Now that's it. Quote. Encouraging black girls to finish high school and stop having babies out of wedlock is the single biggest thing we could do to reduce inner city poverty. You could take that exact quote and put it in Ronald Reagan's mouth. Okay, and it would be appropriate.
That was Barack Obama's quote?
Yes.
Okay.
Refusing to attend the Durban 2 and Durban 3 World Conferences Against Racism. Now, with Durban 2 more so than Durban 3, the administration not only were boycotting it, but as they were boycotting it, they were telling these other sovereign nations they were having a meeting regarding racism and Zionism, and they said they needed to take these three things out. This is Barack Obama's administration, along with the nation of Israel, doing this. Don't talk about the enslavement of African people in America as a crime against humanity. Don't talk about reparations for black people, and don't talk about Zionism as a form of racism. Okay? So Israel and the United States and the Obama administration were putting pressure on the leaders, the conveners of these conferences not to talk about this stuff. Okay? And even Barack Obama himself has said several times that he is an opponent of the idea of black people getting reparations. again, something else, Obama's statement that 90% of the nation's racial problems have been resolved. We know that's not true. Let's move on. We talked in economic exploitation, we talked about the presidential campaign being funded by many of these exploitive corporations. Most of that, like I said, I refer you to Barack Obama and the Future of American Politics by Paul Street, and The Empire's New Clothes as well. It's another great book. We'll move on in the interest of time. We'll just sort of speed right through this. Militarism. I could take all of this off and just put what he did in the selling of weapons to Saudi Arabia to further their cause and to further their destruction of Yemen. And that would be enough in and of itself, but that's certainly not the only thing, okay? The expansion of wars, there's a book called Dirty Wars, The World is a Battlefield, and it talks about the Obama administration's work to expand this fighting against terrorism, so to speak, and using these nations as a stage to fight against terrorism. Okay? Use of drones, drone warfare, the expansion of drone warfare. We think we can thank the Obama administration for that. The total collapse of Libya and the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, which you can say what you want about Muammar Gaddafi, but one thing that you can also say is that at least he ran a tight ship. And when he was taken, that void in leadership was filled by racist, reactionary Libyans who then began attacking wholesale and having these pogroms against black Libyans and black South Africans from people from southern part of Africa who were living in Libya. Okay, and right now there's a slave trade going on. I'm sure you may have seen the video that was released maybe about 2 years ago or so, maybe about a year ago, talking about where black people were being sold on the market in Libya for $400 a piece. Okay, we have Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama to thank for that. Okay, they caused the collapse of that society that caused that to happen. Okay, let's move on. Lastly, this is the last thing, and this is not one that I mentioned earlier, and Dr. King, oh yeah, I did mention this earlier. Dr. King and the SCLC's Poor People Campaign was the precursor to the modern Occupy Wall Street movement and the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to talk about for a second the tactics of the Poor People's Campaign, what they were going to do. They were going to have poor people build a shanty town on government property, which became Resurrection City. All right. Have delegations of poor people lobby congressional committees, individual congressmen, and agencies. Hugh and the Department of Agriculture would be targets of sit-ins. Okay, so Hugh is probably, I'm thinking more what we would today call Health and Human Services. Sick people would jam hospital waiting rooms. They would be advocating for free health care. Have school children boycott their classes and picket the Board of Education or the Department of Education. And organize the dumping of ghetto garbage on the steps of the Capitol. Okay? Now the reason I bring this up is because we're not just talking about marching. We're not just talking about walking down the street with signs. Okay? These are tactics that probably would have gotten these people arrested. Definitely would have gotten people arrested. Okay? But you had to do that. Dr. King, in one quote, and I wish we had the time to, I have to mention this. Back to this book again, 121. Upon his release from jail, King told a Birmingham rally that the movement needed an alternative to riots, a method that will disrupt our cities if necessary, create the crisis that will force the nation to look at the situation, dramatize it, and yet at the same time not destroy life and property. In a press conference, he talked of closing down branches of government through nonviolent sit-ins, blockading traffic, and encamping poor people on federal property. Nonviolent strategy required first trying to negotiate with those in power, but if that failed, finding a way to bring issues to the surface, creating a crisis through direct action, provided the first step toward resolving deep social issues. Okay? So we have to be confrontational. So this is what Dr. King was talking about. Now, when you're talking about Resurrection City, who copied that in the more modern context? Occupy Wall Street, right? Didn't they have an encampment in Zuccotti Park? Right? So they got that from, they got that idea, of course, from the Poor People's Campaign. Black Lives Matter, engaging in these types of actions in their own individual cities. So Black Lives Matter New York City would do things like this with their different departments and political figures and what have you. All right? Let's move on. I talked about a lot of stuff on King's assassination. We'll have to come back to that. We don't have time for that. Let's move on. And this is kind of the end of the presentation, but this is the one I didn't mention. If Dr. King were alive today, he would most definitely conclude that the oppression of black people today is just as vicious as it was in the 1950s and 1960s. Okay, I don't foresee too many of us in this room having an issue with that statement, right? Okay. You're talking about the attacks, not only on black people, but on people on the left in general being attacked. You're talking about terrorist actions being waged against churches. You're talking about the resegregation of many of the school districts. The Post and Courier out of Charleston is coming out with a series of stories saying that resegregation is pretty much back as pretty much the norm now in many of South Carolina's school districts. Okay, many of America's schools are as segregated now as they were before '54. Okay. What's the next? Is there something else?
Want me to go to the next one?
Yeah.
Yep.
Where do we go from here? Again, the only thing I'll say about this slide, and I have more to say about it, but we don't have the time now. But what I'll say is that we have to become more intense and in our work, in our activism. The idea of being activists but staying out of the power structure's way that's not going to work anymore. That's not going to work. There has to be a direct confrontation, direct action. Okay, stopping the city fathers and the people who are in control of these cities, especially Horry. And I'm talking about Horry County. I'm talking about us in this room. I'm not speaking in generals. Okay, I'm saying we, everyone in this room, needs to be willing